policy experts to give their comments. May we make it 5 to 7 minutes. If you wish to extend, just request for an extension. The policy experts would be our Dr. Rosario, Manasan, Dr. Mendoza, and also Dr. Professor Pilapil also. Dr. Professor. And then we can go through our legal experts as well. And so perhaps Professor Dr. Manasan, you may have your comments on the draft. Okay. May we have the microphone, please? So I understand Dr. Manasan requests Dr. Mendoza first. Go ahead. Please go ahead, Dr. Mendoza. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm here not just representing myself and the Ateneo School of Government. I'm actually representing over 250 academics and professors who have come up with a statement against CONAS. If you would permit me 5 minutes, I will read the statement, which is now circulating online and in other forms of media. We, the undersigned academics and professionals, are expressing our deep concern as regards the process of reviewing and possibly amending our Constitution. We acknowledge the importance of discussing ways to improve governance in the country, particularly when it comes to a possible shift to a new federal form of government. Some of us actually support federalism, while others oppose it. We have nevertheless united in this common statement to acknowledge the importance of evidence-based debate and discussion to root out the main benefits and costs of such a reform. Given the far-reaching implications of this reform, we believe the process must be much more participatory, including not just those who are for this reform, but also those who oppose it. International policy experience and evidence suggests that the constitutional reforms are more effective if deliberations are front-loaded at the crafting stage, rather than belatedly appended once these reforms are already ratified. The present environment is not conducive to reforming the Constitution. The most recent nationwide surveys of SWS and Pulse Asia last March 2018 show that only 25% of our citizens sufficiently understand our existing Constitution, while only 37% support the shift to federalism. 64% are against charter change. Changing the Constitution also ranked last in the most urgent national concerns, with only 3% of the Filipinos saying that it should be acted upon immediately. We do not support calls to channel this reform through a constitutional assembly. Almost 80% of Congress is comprised of political dynasties, and the empirical evidence suggests that a majority of them may face deep conflict of interest if a new constitution aims for reforms that level the political playing field. The risk of capture by vested interests affecting our present politics is too great. We do not support calls to postpone or cancel elections in 2019. Finally, we believe that there are more pressing and immediate policy challenges that our leaders must address. The rising death toll linked to the anti-drugs campaign, which now includes many children and young people, the killings of political leaders and priests, also further raise the specter of injustice. Rising prices of basic commodities, transportation, and other needs are also hitting the poor, our workers, and millions of low-income households. If these are unresolved, then how can we credibly unite around rule of law and human rights under an amended constitution? A constitution is supposed to bind our nation in common values and a shared vision. It is the very glue that should unite us all in common purpose. If we are to amend the Constitution, we must invest not just in the outcome, but in the very process itself. This is a broad discussion that must bring together our citizens from all walks of life, professions, and political leanings. It is a national discourse that must allay fears, clarify concern, and bring us all towards common ground. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Mendoza. Perhaps later on we will also ask you to comment on the provisions, the proposed provisions of the draft constitution as presented by the CONCOM. Dr. Manasan, you have the floor, ma'am. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My presentation, I hope they can show it, has a number of parts. First, I want to point out that there are potential benefits from adopting a federal form of government. And these benefits relate to increased efficiency and societal welfare to the extent that regional governments, being closer to the people, are better able to respond to the needs and preferences of local constituents, and that to the extent that there is enhanced local accountability if regional governments have some degree of revenue autonomy. But I would like to also point out that these gains are gains that are largely a function of the extent of decentralization. And you can have the gains may be secured with greater fiscal decentralization, with or without a shift to a federal form of government. With or without. Countries with a federal system of government are not necessarily decentralized to the same degree, and some of them may even be less decentralized than those with unitary form of government. And examples in the literature would say Germany, which is federal, is more centralized than Canada, which is also federal. Malaysia, which is federal, is more centralized than Indonesia, for example, which is has a unitary system. So the first guidepost, I think, I propose in assessing the draft constitution is, does the draft constitution provide for greater decentralization? Having laid out the premises earlier. Now, what is the difference between a multi-tiered unitary system and a federal system? By a multi-tiered unitary system, which is what we have now, as pointed out earlier, powers of subnational governments are based on central government legislation, i.e. the powers are delegated by the central government and can be unilaterally withdrawn by the central government. On the other hand, under a federal system, the division of powers between federal and state or regional governments are written and guaranteed in the Constitution, and the federal government or regional governments cannot unilaterally alter the division of powers. So the second guidepost in assessing the draft constitution is the division of powers and resources between the federal government and the regional governments clearly written and guaranteed in the draft constitution. Now, there are 4 design issues. Let me go now into the nitty-gritty of assessing, and I'm just focusing on the fiscal aspects of a federal government. There are 4 design issues or 4 pillars. Again, this is based on the economic literature on fiscal federalism. Expenditure assignment, which I think is referred to sometimes as division of powers. Tax assignment, which level of government taxes what. Transfers between federal government and the regional governments, and sub-national credit finance or borrowing of regional governments. Now, the design is very important. Of these 4 pillars is very important because they define the rules of the game, so to speak. They are the institutions that affect the behavior of both political leaders and voters at both the national and local level. So they affect incentives, in other words. Now, let me take them one by one. This is I hope.
Please
so
proceed.
the first pillar is expenditure assignment. And what is very, very important here is clarity in the expenditure assignment. Because otherwise, if there's no clarity, it's very difficult to hold different levels of governments accountable for delivery of services they are responsible for. So you have to know what each level, federal, regional, what they are responsible for. So you can hold, voters can hold their leaders accountable. So ambiguity is likely to result in either duplication of efforts in service delivery or under provision of some services. In practice, there is really no single best assignment. But it's very important that there is clarity and that in general, functions whose benefits are national in scope are best assigned to federal. Those whose benefits are local in scope are assigned to regional government. So it's sort of very intuitive. So the third guidepost in assessing the draft constitution, I think, is how clear is that articulation of the assignment division of powers between the federal and regional governments. Now, with regards to the second pillar, which is assignment or allocation of taxing powers, the guidance from the literature is that regional governments should have a significant degree of revenue autonomy, meaning regional governments should be able to raise revenues whose level they control. They should not always be dependent on transfers. Again, why do we need this? To make them more accountable to their constituents. And then there are some guidance on what kind of taxes on immobile factors are best assigned to regional governments, or real property taxes, etc. And then taxes which interfere with international trade and interjurisdictional trade are best assigned to federal government. So the fourth guidepost is, does the draft constitution provide regional governments with significant degree of revenue autonomy? So that's the fourth guidepost. On transfers, there are transfers, intergovernmental transfers may be used to address the imbalance between budgetary requirement of the functions assigned to the different levels and the revenues that are actually assigned to them, i.e. to address the mismatch between expenditure assignments and the expenditure needs and the resources that are given to them. On the other hand, transfers may also be used to address the wide disparity in fiscal capacity of national governments, and this is what is referred to in the draft constitution as the equalization fund or equalization grant. Now, let me go on. I'll skip the one on borrowings because there's no provision in the draft constitution on borrowings. But I think prospectively, there should be something there. Because if you look at the experience, I'll just go through this very briefly. Can you move forward, please? I'm not controlling it. Yeah. Access to borrowing is very important because that's how regional governments will be able to finance infrastructure. However, the experience of many Latin American countries in the 1990s underscore fiscal risk associated with poor subnational government debt policy and management. And what's important to address this concern is the commitment on the part of the federal government not to bail out fiscally distressed regional governments. As I said, there's no provision, the draft constitution is silent on this. Next, please. But even more important than the assignment of expenditure functions and taxing powers to federal and regional governments is the internal consistency and coherence in the design of the four pillars. In other words, it's very important to look at those four pillars as a system rather than isa-isa individually. For one, finance should follow function. Now let me go into an assessment of the specific provisions of the draft constitution, if you will allow me. Next, please. The Article 11, Section 1 talks of the 16 federated regions, the Bangsamoro and the Cordillera, so a total of 18. Then it says the apportioned components are in the appended ordinance, but there is no appended ordinance. So again, here I ask the question, what is really, parang nasan yung constitutional guarantee on the regions and how they will operate? It says Congress may by law create, abolish, merge, and divide. So even the regions, hindi siya guaranteed because they can be abolished by Congress. So that's the first question. The second one relates to Article 12, Section 1. Article 12, Section 1 talks of the list of exclusive legislative powers. I will not read them, they were discussed. Section 2 next talks of the list of exclusive powers assigned to the federated regions. If you look at this list, 5 are new in the sense that they are not assigned now to subnational governments, economic zones, justice system, local governments, indigenous people, culture. Those are new. But at the same time, 5 powers that are now assigned to regional governments or local governments, walang provision na exclusive siya o shared. So those are, right there at the bottom, agricultural extension, natural resource management, environmental services, control, social welfare services, and very important, health services. So parang, if you look at this together, less decentralized. And if we're saying that the benefits come from decentralization, then there is weakness there, I think. Next, the assignment of functional responsibilities suffers from next please, lack of clarity. If you look at Article 12, Section 4, it talks of shared powers. Article 12, Section 5 talks of reserved powers being given to the federal government. But taken together, you don't know what are shared and what are reserved. Why? Because there's no list of shared powers. In constitutions of other countries where they talk of reserved powers, may listahan talaga. India has a list, Malaysia has a list of shared powers. So, unless you know what the shared powers are, then you don't know what the reserved powers are. And who will determine that, and how do we determine that? Assignment of taxing powers. Some gains, some losses here. Next, please. Real property tax is an existing local government tax. Estate tax, donors tax, those are now national government taxes. Estate and donors tax is about 6.6 billion in 2016. Documentary stamp tax, I put a question mark there. It's right now, it has a big value, it's about 80 billion. But the question is, this is in fact something that we want to reduce prospectively because it is a bad tax from the perspective of encouraging business investments. You know, when capital market development, kasi the more you trade, patong ng patong ng patong. Road users tax, I think I agree with the point raised earlier. It's appropriately a local or regional tax. Vehicle registration fees, correctly regional tax, as well as transport franchise tax, and the values there indicates the collection of the central government in 2016. But at the same time, the draft constitution is silent about the local business tax, which amounts to about 70 billion. So here, some gains, some losses, if I'm looking at it from the perspective of subnational governments. Intergovernmental transfers next, please. It says the transfer should not be less than 50% of collected income taxes, excise, value-added, customs duties, which may be equally divided among them. And here I underline or emphasize the points equally divided, because this might not actually be the most reasonable way or fair way of dividing. I mean, if you're just thinking of service delivery is normally tied to population. So some will need more than their just equal share. In fact, when you have anything where you divide by n, the tendency is to create additional regions in the future. Think of the local government code where the tendency is to create more cities because they will get a higher share of the pie. At the same time, is 50% the right amount? Because here, why are we giving these transfers? The reason for giving these transfers is you have assigned them functions which goes with some cost of delivery. You have given them revenues, and normally they don't quite balance. So you want to give them transfers to fill in the gap. But if you don't know exactly what those functions are, because there is ambiguity there, how do you know how much should the transfers be? Di ba? Kasi gap filling lang yun. Okay. Then it talks of an equalization fund. The equalization fund, I agree, is very important, but here I give the principles, the one in red. This comes again from the guidance in the literature. What is the principle behind the design of the equalization transfers? Because in the draft constitution, the principle appears to be financial viability and economic sustainability. Those are not quite the design principles for an equalization fund, which is equalizing fiscal capacity, meaning their revenue base. Recall, some regions would have lower revenue bases kasi lower yung activity doon, lower yung real property tax, values, etc., as well as differential expenditure needs. Okay. Fiscal cost. These are, when I talk of fiscal cost, next please, I think, when I talk of fiscal cost, I'm referring to here the additional bureaucratic cost of shifting to a federal system of government. Next, please. So included here are the salaries of the governors, vice governors of the regional government, salaries of the senators at the federal level, may additional because now we have 2 senators per regional government, so that's 36 versus the present 24. Salaries of legislators, of regional governments and their staff, as well as operating expense of their offices under the draft constitution. It's 1 per province, a highly urbanized city, and independent chartered city, comprising the federated region, plus another half coming from political parties under a proportional representation system. And because and here I'm making the assumption, because asymmetric yung treatment ng regions, that the Regional Assembly of Bangsamoro, for instance, will follow the BBL. I don't know if that will happen, but I'm assuming here that it will be so because the draft constitution talks of asymmetry. So I'm assuming it's 80 each from Bangsamoro and Cordillera. So there will be a total of 374 legislators for the 18 regional governments. And then the salaries of additional members of the judiciary at the regional government level, as well as their staff and operating expenses. Now, in making all these computations, the basis is the salaries, operating costs, etc., based on the 2018 GAA. Ding, 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 the estimated additional fiscal burden, and this is recurrent, meaning yearly, is about 55 billion pesos per year. It's recurrent cost. Wala dyan yung additional cost kung magtatayo ng bagong building. And I would like to emphasize that the cost here of regional operations of departments that will prospectively be transferred to or regionalized under the proposal is not counted. And then the additional members of the House of Representatives, which will grow from 240 to 400, is not costed. I think I can stop there. The next part, just to show what I'm not going to talk about. Next, please. Last slide. I talk of risk. I talk of risk in adopting the federal system, but I think my friends here, I've heard them make presentations before, will address those better than I can. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Manasan. We have the Professor Pilapil.
Good afternoon, Senator Pangilinan.
Before you proceed, we'd like to also place on record and acknowledge the presence of Senator Win Gatchalian. Thank you for joining us. Please proceed.
Okay. Good afternoon, Senator Pangilinan, Senator Angara, Senator Bamakino, and Senator Gatchalian. Thank you for the opportunity to once again speak in the Senate hearing on constitutional amendments. Since I only have a few minutes, let me go straight to the point. The proposed constitution of the Consultative Committee, CONCOM, submitted to President Duterte on July 9, is the third federal constitution produced under the Duterte administration. Like the resolution of both houses number 8 by Representatives Eugene De Vera and Aurelio Gonzalez Jr. in 2016, and the Constitution of the Federal Republic of the Philippines by the PDP Laban Federalism Study Group in 2017, the institutional design of its federalism and overall constitution is a failure. In terms of institutional design, the CONCOM constitution is best described as a grocery list of institutions whose unifying logic is that the members were given a long pad to write their preferred items on. For the CONCOM constitution, together with the ever so confident statements of the members of the committee, was written as if it was confined in an intellectual vacuum, where it has remained untouched by the critical insights of the literature on institutional design in political science. This is the very literature that specializes on what the committee was trying to do and populated by top scholars acknowledged as the real experts on these institutional design questions. It is true that the CONCOM Constitution is not as crazy as the PDP Laban Constitution that argued for a simultaneous federal and semi-presidential transition. But it is also true that although it rejected a semi-presidential transition, the CONCOM Constitution is nevertheless still sweeping in its planned transition to federalism and the restructuring of key political institutions. Such sweep includes, and this is peculiar to this Constitution, a mind-boggling overhaul of the institutional design of the judicial system, now with quadrilateral high courts and a separated system of federal and regional level judiciary, and whose elaborate review, advisory, and impeachment powers seem to compete for the spotlight with the federal structure that it is introducing. the CONCOM Constitution's explicit provisions on federalism, political dynasties, political parties, judiciary, federal constitutional commissions, etc., and the all-important implicit assumptions that underline them, seem to ignore, undermine, contradict, or are simply blissfully unaware of the many basic principles and serious concerns of the institutional design and redesign, especially if you are tinkering with an already functioning democratic constitution. Among the most important of these critical insights contravened throughout by the CONCOM Constitution in its grand constitutional vision for the Philippines, I only list 7. A, the folly of hyper-rationality, which is the mistaken belief that just because the formal rules are changed, the old behavior of politicians will also change. B, the importance of sequencing of reforms based on the quote-unquote unsimultaneous time horizons, unquote, of different reforms for them to work, as against the concept of Big Bang, grand bargain, long list of reforms introduced at one go. C, the danger of quote-unquote over-reforming, because reforms introduce new problems and at times can be worse than the problem initially being addressed. Related terms are, quote-unquote, reform should correct those flaws as specifically as possible, and better the devil you know than the devil you do not know. D, underestimating the law of unintended consequences, where new institutions do not function the way the designers originally intended. In fact, they function opposite of the framer's intention. Plain English translation is, the road to hell is paved with the best of intentions. E, the crucial role of path dependency. Basically, who are first empowered by the introduction of the new constitution that would determine the manner how the reforms are later shaped. Hence, the overwhelming importance of the transitory provisions of the new constitution. F, the important distinctions among macro level, for example, system of government, unitary federal, meso level, for example, electoral system or party system, and micro level, for example, legislative sub-rules, okay, institutional reforms, and their implication for constitutional engineering. G, the danger of excessive optimism in reforms, because it can easily lead to excessive disillusionment. Afterwards, as would most likely happen with reforms with exaggerated promises. But even as a text of the CONCOM Constitution ended up being longer than the 1987 Constitution and identified sweeping revisions of the current Constitution it was tasked to review, it still failed to do what for me is its most important homework. This is to write a Constitution that has a believable transition plan on how to move from the current unitary to the new federal state, the most institutionally complex experiment this country will undertake under democratic conditions. That's its constitution so audaciously identified as its end goal. For a while, the CONCOM federal constitution has the temerity to eternally lock the country and all future generations of Filipinos to federalism by constitutionally entrenching federalism through an eternity clause, Section 4, Article 21, where no constitutional amendment or revision can change its federal character. It is nevertheless willing to leave the country to wander indefinitely in an institutional wilderness as it lacked a map for the transition itself. Instead of a credible map, it creates an all-powerful Federal Transition Commission, henceforth Transition Commission, that will not simply oversee the transition, but would do the task that the consultative committee, after being given almost 5 months and funded millions of pesos, should have done in the first place, the actual plan for the transition. Similar to other unitary countries like Spain, Belgium, South Africa, Iraq, and Nepal that adopted federal constitutions. That the CONCOM constitution fails to provide a crucial transition plan is not surprising, given that both RBH number 8 and the PDP Laban constitution also failed most miserably to give the country the all-important plan on how to get from point A to point B. The PDP Laban best manifested this dismal failure by leaving its article transitory provisions, Article 18, empty, with the footnote carrying the lamest of excuse, quote-unquote, understudy. But at least the PDP Laban Constitution provides a serious transition plan for its federalism in its article on regional and local government, Article 10. But once analyzed, its roadmap for an evolutionary transition could easily get stuck in the middle of nowhere, as its terribly flawed institutional design would paradoxically result in giving more veto powers to the central government in controlling the devolution of powers to the region, Section 24, Article 10 of PDP Laban, than found in the 1987 Constitution, while succeeding in empowering local politicians to build regional bases, making the transition for some from local warlords to regional warlords by giving the interim regional commission not only monopoly of executive powers, but also legislative powers at the regional level, Section 28B and Section 28E, and also making that regional commission an appointment super body of the region for at least 5 years that would create the regional bureaucracies. Hence leveling the region, hence leveling up clientelistic levels from provincial to regional. Section 28C. As if a cruel joke, the transition plan does indeed fulfill PDP Laban's often declared promise and assurance of arriving at a truly uniquely Filipino federalism, but in a dreadful manner of bringing Filipinos to a place that is neither here nor there, as many of its features combine some of the worst features of unitary and federal systems. The CONCOM Constitution seemed to have learned the wrong lesson in PDP Laban's folly by not even daring to plan its transition for federalism. By doing so, many of the hardest questions of how to affect its federalism, the answers to which may transform this CONCOM Constitution from a grocery list to a more serious blueprint of governance in the next decades of this country, were avoided. No wonder the consultative committee finished its constitution 2 weeks ahead of President Duterte's SONA. It passed this crucial, dirty, and most difficult job to someone else. But in coming up with the Transition Commission, the CONCOM Constitution does not simply pass the pen for it to write down and implement the transition plan, but provides it with a shotgun to preside the transition by bestowing the Transition Commission with all-encompassing powers for its vague transition process. Okay? See Section 2, Article 22 of the original version, especially 2D, quote, to exercise all powers necessary and proper to ensure a smooth, speedy, and successful transition, unquote. Its initial plan was to have the incumbent president also as the transition president by heading the 11-person transition commission. The 10 other members are to be chosen by a search committee whose members are to be chosen by the president himself, thus giving him full control of both the committee and the transition commission. Because the CONCOM refused the call to explicitly ban the incumbent president from running for president in their new constitution, as it argued that it will be undemocratic and discriminatory because it singles out one person, what happens is a double bonanza for the incumbent president. First, he is allowed to run in the new constitution, and second, as transition president with additional powers, enjoys a grossly advantageous position if he eventually chooses to run under the new constitution. Note that in this sense, the institutional design of the CONCOM transition, underneath its more polished language, is actually similar to the quasi-revolutionary powers of both RBH 8 and the House Concurrent Resolution number 9 that was passed on January 16, 2018, that were all tailor-made for President Duterte as incumbent president and re-electionist candidate. The original CONCOM idea was on June 30, 2022, coinciding with the end of the term of the new president and the start of the new president, who initially could have been the same person. The Transition Commission would not have only come up with a plan for the transition, but also have implemented it. See Section 2C, Article 12, original version, I quote, to organize, reorganize, and fully establish the federal government and the governments of the federated regions in accordance with the Constitution, unquote. Since the CONCOM members in their public statements specifically target the May 2019 local and national elections as also the time of the plebiscite for their constitution, this means the transition from plan to execution is to be done in just 3 years. These are twin horrors in constitutional engineering and are classic cases of brute political factors overriding any institutional design logic. First, this means that the plebiscite campaign will have to compete with the noise of the campaign of thousands of local officials and senatorial candidates. This will definitely drown out the needed careful deliberation of the most fundamental decision a citizen can make, which is a yes or no decision on whether to accept a new constitution that will now serve as the most basic institutional framework of his or her existence. This piggybacking is sheer folly, considering that the March 2018's SWS survey showed only 1 out of 4 Filipinos has a minimalist understanding of federalism. Government propaganda will not significantly increase that percentage in the 60 or 90-day campaign period, even if that was the only thing that will be discussed, which will not even be the case. Remember that the last time a plebiscite was piggybacked with other issues is the orchestrated plebiscite of Marcos' 1973 martial law constitution, supposedly done from January 10 to 15, 1973. Second, just for the sake of argument, if all the immense complexity of the CONCOM constitution, which as I've argued is a long grocery list, is executed in just 3 years, there is a very high risk of bringing the country not into a dizzying pace of change, but, as institutional design literature has warned in terms of unintended consequences, of bringing the country to near standstill because of the chaos of the enormity of the task needed to create all the new institutions of the CONCOM Constitution. But this initial transition plan of the CONCOM has been revised by the intervention of the very hand that created it. President Duterte responds to the challenge of the critics of a ban Duterte provision by asking the CONCOM to write down the provision barring him from running in 2022. He raises the ante even more as he asks his CONCOM to write down another provision calling for presidential and vice presidential elections next year because he promises to resign once the Constitution is ratified in 2019, and thereby creating a supposed vacancy on who will be the transition president who will oversee the shift to federalism. It is very difficult to take the president seriously when he promises to resign, since he has promised to resign on so many issues that irritate him. And this promise to resign in 2019 might yet be of the same weight as his campaign promise in 2016 to resign if the first 6 months of his presidency he did not eradicate drugs and corruption in the country. My reading here is that his promise to resign come 2019 is simultaneously a bluff and also indicative of the lack of seriousness in the output of his own COMCOM. Probably because he knows very well that the real writing of the Constitution will happen in the Congress, and with his lieutenants fully in control of the House, no way would they allow him to bid them goodbye midway in his term. The CONCOM ban on his re-election is a significant step in the right direction and one key institutional challenge to protect democracy is to commit the final outcome of Congress, if ever, to contain this crucial ban. However, the attempt to cut short his term is clearly a retrogressive one because this undermines the electoral mandate of the 16.6 million who voted for Duterte. But even worse than Duterte's is the term of Vice President Leni Robredo, who is dragged into this stunt and whose term will also be cut short by the request of Duterte. In the case of Robredo, it is not just the 14.4 million who voted her who would be disenfranchised of their vote, but also she herself, who has no plan to abandon her mandate and is actually the constitutional successor of the 1987 Constitution if the President decides to resign. This could only be described as a reverse power grab or a sort of impeachment via new Constitution and is utterly contemptuous of the electoral, hence democratic mandate bestowed on her by the 1987 Constitution. Mad as the stand of the President, especially on the VP, madder still is the CONCOM agreeing to this cavalier suggestion of constitutional strangulation of democratic mandates. For one moment, I was expecting someone from the 22-man and one-woman CONCOM would resign in protest because of this democratic disenfranchisement. In fact, I did not even hear any strong protest about this. Only statements that Duterte's request suggestion will complicate things during the transition. Take note that we have not even started the new Constitution, and yet what we are already seeing are immediately both institutional and democratic erosions, as the one-man wrecking crew that had already eroded democratic institutions under the 1987 Constitution is already giving a sneak preview of what he will do under the new federal Constitution. That, notwithstanding all recent pronouncements to the contrary, he will most likely still lead as incumbent president, transition president, or re-elected president if he could get away with it. To conclude, the institutional design of the CONCOM Constitution does not move us far from the two other constitutions. All three are failures as federal constitutions. But the CONCOM's real achievement is political. In reviving the Duterte administration's charter change campaign, after it was bludgeoned last January 2018 by House Speaker Pantaleon Alvarez and the lower house, as they brazenly tried to use charter change to push for a no-election scenario in May 2019 to self-servingly extend their terms in office. As evidence, here we are again, even on a rainy day, in this Senate hearing on yet another round of more of the same institutional design nonsense. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pilapil. Order, please. We will allow the senators present a first round of questions, and they will be given 3 minutes each to ask their questions. After which, after the first round, we will go back to our resource persons and ask them to give their comments. We are trying our best to balance the inputs of our resource persons as well as the ability of our senators to be able to raise their questions. So that will be a first round, and based on our, and not our rules, but tradition, the first one who arrived would be the first to raise the questions. That would be Senator Bam Aquino, after which Senator Angara, and then Senator Gatchalian. Please go ahead, Senator Aquino, you have the floor.
Maraming salamat, Mr. Chairman. Magandang hapon po sa lahat ng mga resource speakers po natin. All of our esteemed friends and colleagues who are here. Congressman Colmenares, magandang hapon po. Sir Joel. My questions are for Chief Justice Puno, no, primarily. And when you respond, sir, you may respond and clarify if this is the stand of the Commission or if this is your own personal stand, no? I'll go into some of the specifics of the charter, maybe in the second or third round. But initially, I'd just like to get your inputs regarding the process. No? In our first hearing, naalala ko po na tinanong na po kayo directly, if you imagine any scenario which is constitutional, where only one House of Congress will undergo the process. So gusto ko lang po tanungin ulit, kung meron pong proseso na gagawin na yung House of Representatives lang po yung gagawa at hindi po kasama yung Senado, ito po ba ay constitutional sa anumang pagpaplano ng pagpalit po ng ating konstitusyon?
Noon pong hearing na yun na pinatawag din ng Senado, ay tinanong kami kung ano ang pag-iisip namin doon sa issue na yun.
Opo.
Kung voting separately yung dalawang houses of Congress o voting jointly. And I express my personal opinion that the voting should be done separately by both houses of Congress. And I gave the reasons for that opinion. Historical reasons, a coherent reading of the different provisions of the Constitution, the need to know the intent of the makers of our Constitution. But I also said that that is one school of thought. And I do not claim to be the legal Einstein of our Constitution. So there is another school of thought, and I respect that. And perhaps these two schools of thought have to contend with each other before our Supreme Court.
Chief, napag-usapan niyo po ba ito sa inyong Constitutional Commission? Yung proseso ng CONAS at kung ito ay kailangang igawa o isagawa po na voting separately o voting jointly?
Mayroon pong provision yung draft constitution stating that voting should be separate.
Alright. Ito po ba'y pinagbotohan po ninyo sa komisyon?
Pinagbotohan po yan.
At ano po yung nanalo?
Iyan po ay doon sa ating bagong itong draft constitution.
Yes,
Na
but-
kung sakaling ito ay pagtitibayin, maliwanag doon na yung voting should be separate.
Opo. Dito po sa bagong konstitusyon na na-draft po ninyo. Pero ngayon po, yung prosesong pagdadaanan po natin, and as you know, this is subject of statements from the Speaker, statements from senators. Napag-usapan po ba ninyo sa Constitutional Commission kung yung proseso po ng CONAS o yung proseso po ng pagbubukas ay pwede gawing jointly or separately?
Hindi po tinalakay doon sa Constitutional Consultative Commission kung ano ang gustong sabihin ng provision na yan under the 87 Constitution.
Alright, hindi nyo po pinag-usapan, but your personal opinion is that it should be voting separately.
Yes.
May I ask the other members of the commission who are here, that's Professor Tayaw, Professor Tihanki, Justice Natura, ano po yung tingin nila sa, and of course, Senator Pimentel, ano po yung tingin po nila dito sa tanong na jointly or separately? Senator Pimentel, may we have your opinion po on the matter? I think you've already stated this publicly, but if we may get this for the record.
Para sa akin, Senator Ma'am, kailangan voting separately.
Opo.
Alam mo kung bakit?
Opo.
Ang 280 plus members of the House will deluge you, 24 senators, if you vote jointly. Mas maganda siguro you vote separately so that the 24 senators can determine for themselves with majority vote ano ang pakay nila sa bagay na ito. In the same manner that the House will also do that on their own.
Let me take a step back, Senator Nene. Yung pagbubukas po ng proseso, kinakailangan po ng resolution from both houses, from the upper chamber and the lower chamber. Tama po, no?
That's right, opo.
Pwede po bang magsagawa ng isang tsa-tsa ang lower house lamang na wala pong resolusyon mula po sa Senado?
Sa isip ni Alvarez lang yun, pero hindi mangyari.
Sa inyo po, at tinatanong ko po sa inyo because we value your opinion.
No, it cannot be done.
Alright.
Sila lang.
May I ask Justice Natura the same question? Ken, in your opinion po, and of course you're all you're a former Justice of the Supreme Court as well. Tingin niyo po ba pwedeng gawin ito ng lower house po lamang?
Senator, meron akong libro on constitutional law.
Opo.
Ang nakalagay doon, separate voting.
Thank you po.
Alangan naman na baguhin ko pa yon.
Marami nung nagbasa po niyan. Professor Tihanki and Professor Tayaw.
Before Professor July answers, earlier, just with the permission of Senator
Yes.
Bam, you asked a question about whether a resolution from the Senate, without a resolution from the Senate, can the House proceed? Senator Pimentel said that is not possible. Just for the record, I saw Chief Justice Puno nodding his head, so he agrees that without a Senate resolution.
I agree with
Thank you.
Senate President Pimentel.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator
Yes.
Bam. Please proceed, Professor Tihanki.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Earlier, the concept of unintended consequence was mentioned, no? And to my mind, this is exactly the unintended consequence of the omission of the 1987 Constitution to clarify that Congress should vote separately. But of course, if we follow the principles and the logic and the spirit behind the provision, I also agree with my senior colleagues that both chambers should vote separately.
Right. Professor Tayo, very quickly lang po.
As quickly as possible, I agree with all of them.
Thank you. Chief Justice Puno, sa pag-uusap po ninyo tungkol sa possible charter change, never nyo po sinabi na ipopostpone yung 2019 elections. Is that correct?
Tama po yun dahil sa palagay ng consultative committee, and this is a unanimous opinion, ang may karapatang magsabi niyan ay ang Kongreso. yan that issue falls within the exclusive power and prerogative of Congress. Kanya kami, hindi kami nagbibigay ng opinion dyan.
Sinasabi niyo po na it's up to Congress.
Yes.
Hindi niyo po sinasabi na hindi kayo sumasang-ayon either or. So you're neutral on the matter and you're leaving it to Congress.
Opo, dahil nga power ng Kongreso yun, ayaw naming pakialaman
Well,
yun.
Chief, no, just for your information, a number of senators cross-party have already made a stand na hindi ho dapat ma-postpone yung eleksyon. Kasi yung eleksyon po, haligi po ng demokrasya. Kapag binuwag mo po yung haligi na yon, baka gumuho po yung demokrasya natin. So number of us have already said we are not in favor of postponing the election. Now, the reason I think why nilalabas po yung postponement of election is because of the timetable. So tatanungin ko rin po kayo, ano po ba yung timetable po na nasa isip ninyo? Because some senators have said, let's tackle this after the elections. Let's tackle this kapag nag-settle down na. Hindi naman to kailangang madaliin. Do you agree, Chief Justice?
Muli po, yung timetable nasa Kongreso yun eh.
So, whether this is done in 2020, 2021, or end of 2019, it does not matter to the Commission po.
The reason is because we do not want to encroach on that exclusive prerogative of Congress.
So, in short, you're silent on the matter.
Yes, whatever the Congress would say, we will follow the decision of Congress. That is the nature of an exclusive power.
Okay. I know I'm running out of time. So, one final question. Dun sa anti-dynasty, no, maybe somebody else can answer also para nilan po si Chief Justice. Gusto ko lang pong linawin. Firstly, I think we all agree, a federal system without an anti-dynasty provision will not work. No, I think that has been publicly stated by members of the Commission as well. Pero gusto ko lang pong linawin, yung anti-dynasty provision na ito makes a distinction between national, regional, and local. Is that correct? I think Mr. Generoso earlier averred to that, no? Maybe, Professor Tiaki, can you explain to us ano po yung differences or ano po yung nuance po ng anti-dynasty provision po na ito?
Okay, thank you, Senator Aquino. First of all, of course, most of us who have been actively campaigning for this particular political reform are familiar with the difference between regulation and total ban, no? And total banning means lahat bawal, di ba? So, and if those who have done real work on the subject matter agree, including Dean Ron Mendoza and myself, agree that regulation is the way to go. And our regulation is regulating members of political families and political clans from second degree of consanguinity and affinity from one succeeding each other, and that is what Dean Mendoza calls the Tin dynasty, which is prevalent but not really a big issue. The big issue here would be the so-called Fat dynasty.
Yung sabay-sabay.
Sabay-sabay lahat na-elect, no? So what we did was the first provision would be no succession whatsoever. So if you are going to succeed your father who's a governor or your
For the same position.
for the same position, you are not banned from running for that position, but you have to wait a term. Okay? So parang term limits na rin yun. The second one, yung multiple running for position. Bawal na po yun under our self-executory provision. And the idea there is a family, a political family can only field candidates either for the national or the regional or local level.
All right, this is my question, Professor Tiangkino. Kasi yung lumalabas po dyan, it's an anti-political dynasty act, except for the president. Because it's only the president and the vice president whom we have identified as a national, in a national position. So in short,
Bawal pong mag-succeed ang anak ng presidente. No succession whatsoever.
yes, but
That's the first,
pwedeng...
dalawa po yun eh. Dalawa
Oo.
po yung provision. The first, bawal mag-succeed. Lahat, both national, regional,
And local. Oo.
Lahat yun, sakop. Ngayon, doon sa mga multiple candidacy, bawal din ho yun. So
Okay.
halimbawa, may tumakbong mayor sa isang probinsya, bawal nang tumakbo yung kamag-anak niyang presidente.
Okay. So, but
Pwede pala, pwede. Pwede
Oo.
palang tumakbo.
Sorry,
Bawal tumakbo sa local. So hanggang 2 posisyon lang.
Which positions are these?
National, tsaka regional or local.
So, pwede kang magka-national. But again, the national is just the president and the vice president.
Yes, aha.
So, we're allowing the president and the vice president to have a simultaneous child, wife, or grandchild
Yes.
as governor, senator, or mayor.
Yes.
So,
Diba? Yes.
why the exception? Because again, isa lang naman, o dalawa lang naman yung national positions natin, ng presidente at vice president. Bakit di nyo na po, parang napaka-convenient,
Okay,
no?
kasi ganito po, mahaba pong diskusyon yan, nagkutuhan po kami dyan. Kasi po, may isa kaming kasama na nagsabi na, baka naman halimbawa, may mga tatakbong presidente, siyempre politika, may patakbuhin sa local para lang ma-disqualify yung tatakbo sa taas. So, isa yun sa mga naging consideration namin, no?
Pero
So,
kailangan anak niya, asawa niya, or grandchild niya.
well, actually, meron din mga nagsabi na bakit hindi pwedeng dalawa? Diba? Natalo po yun.
Yan yung Dynasty 2, di ba?
Oo,
Okay.
Di ba? May mga nagsabi pong dalawa, pero hindi po nanalo yon. So, ang napagbotohan po ng NBank namin ay payagan po
Okay.
yung isang national tsaka isang...
So just to be clear,
Apo.
ang regional at ang local pwede isabay?
Hindi.
Hindi. Ang national at local pwede.
Pwede.
Ang national tsaka
Pero
regional,
kukonti lang po yun dahil presidente at vice-presidente.
yun na nga. So it's an exception only for the president and the vice president, technically.
Opo.
Yes.
Eh ako po, gusto ko lahat eh. So, kung
Okay.
pwede yun yung
Now,
papasukin.
were you outvoted, Professor Tia? Was this,
This was under the Subcommittee on Political Reforms and Leveling the Playing Field, of which I chaired. So, ito pong mga provisions sa political reforms na mali-mali daw, sabi ng kasama natin, kami po ang nagtrabaho. At karamihan po dito ay ibinase na natin sa matagal ng pinagdedebatihan, pinag-uusapan dito sa Kongreso. In fact, a large part of the reforms that we have introduced and constitutionalized were actually adopted from the Senate bills that have been debated here and even in the House.
well, our versions do not have an exception for the president.
Yes, I would have wanted total.
Okay.
So-
So in short, meron tayong anti-political dynasty provision.
Opo.
Pero ang exception mo ay ang president tsaka vice president. Now
Opo,
again,
opo.
we're talking about prospective presidents and vice
Opo,
presidents.
opo,
But
opo.
that in itself already, I think, weakens the provision, no? But anyway, all of this naman will go back to us.
Opo.
And
Opo.
if we do open the process, kailangan pa
Yes.
itong pag-usapan.
Yes.
Kung dalawang kandidatong, they'll have to have a toss coin.
Opo.
Correct, no?
Yes,
That's in the
opo.
provision.
Pero hindi po maganda kasi ilagay sa Constitution na toss coin.
No,
So sabi
it's-
namin draw lots.
Sorry, I'm mistaken. Draw lots yung nakalagay.
Opo.
So in short, kung may kapatid ka na tatakbo, within the same category,
Opo.
magdo-draw lots kayo.
Yes.
Okay. Sige, Mr. Chairman, maraming salamat. I have other questions po for the
Yes,
second round.
that's your